Good morning, everybody. Did you have a chance to read the papers I sent?
Some of them.
Some of them, yeah, okay. So me too. It's a kind of a strange situation to be invited to give a formal lecture on the subject matter which hardly exists or is very undefined. And this is the situation with the studies of religious experience, not only in science, but also, and amazingly so, kind of disappointingly so, in theology. What I suggest is that we conduct this. How much time do we have, Marga?
Depends on
how it goes. Yeah, okay.
So, I mean,
all right.
we usually end at noon, but you don't have to. If we're talking for 2 hours, we can, just.
Yeah, we will be interacting. So having in mind that we have 2 hours, we need to agree on how we proceed. So the question is then, while you were reading the papers as few as you could cover, what was your impression? Assuming you are not neuroscientists and not neurologists, right? Not doctors. Okay, so as informed consumers of research, what was your impression from reading those papers? Did it make sense? How?
Personally, I've been interested in the phenomenology of religious experience. I was not able to read the majority of them just due to the circumstance of the semester. But the ones that I did read, I thought they were very informative. I enjoyed them.
Okay, all right. So let me ask you a question then from a different angle. What is religious experience? What is it that we call religious experience? Because in order to research something, it's good to know what it is. And that's a sort of it's a statement from Edith Stein, who was one of the early and very important phenomenologists. So she says that in order to research something, we need to know what it is. And of course, by research, we know what it is. But in order to initiate research, we need at least to define the area of our inquiry in this whole presence of the world, in the world horizon. We need to be able to single out a little window into which we can be looking. So in this huge overall horizon of experience that we have all the time, which is us, in fact. We have human experience, we have experience of theoretical thinking, we have experience of doing research in chemistry, we have experience of traveling, we have experience of acting. We also have something that we call religious experience. So what is it? Like, can you put it somewhere on this scheme of things for me?
It wasn't very clear, right? I mean, it seems that it was such a wide spectrum of what can be considered religious experience and very different causes of what can contribute to having a religious experience.
Exactly.
To the point that it's not very clear what we can say about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, Marga, yeah, thank you. Okay.
I'm not a student here, so I did not receive the papers to read them, but I would add that, I think my understanding is that they're often threshold moments that often have sort of an unexplainable component, an unexpected component, but you end up kind of somewhere else on the other side. You have a different perspective.
So, okay, so what you are doing now already, you are beginning to define it through description, right? So you are bringing in the description of some concrete experiential phenomenon that you call religious experience, and most of the listeners would possibly or likely agree with you that this will be a component of religious experience. But at the same time, this is true what Marga brought in, thank you, Professor, that religious experience is so vast and so confusing, actually, such a confusing category, and it's not just a matter of semantics, that in order to understand what is it that we call religious experience, we need to conduct exactly the kind of studies that you started pointing out to in your description, which is called descriptive studies or descriptive phenomenological studies of religious experience. And as you probably know, I'm a president of the Society for the Phenomenology of Religious Experience. And the reason why we started this society is exactly this, because we talk about religious experience routinely, especially if we are in theology. More than that, we assume that there is such a thing as religious experience, but this assumption itself is highly questionable. Not for me, I don't share that dubious attitude towards religious experience, but for many people, especially in context of a secularized society, religious experience is a very unclear category. And because science is positivist, empiricist science, it is based in the final count on the study of experience. So they don't do it phenomenologically, but science will derive its theories from some kind of empirical observations. Okay, so all theories, all abstractions, all modes of research that we have in science, in the final count, can be wound back to observations which are experiential or empirical. We don't have such observation systematized in case of religious experience, and we don't have the category itself defined strictly and narrowly so that it can become a subject matter for organized, systematic scientific research. And what happens in most cases in scientific research is that the category religious is bracketed out of experience that is studied. And it can be studied through tests, for example, if you are a cognitive scientist. It can be studied in reduction to brain matter, or, whatever science you are in and whatever the subject matter of the science is. But it's across the board, the category religious will be very, very problematic. And if you see something which says spiritual experience, like there is a lot of studies of spirituality in business, spirituality in medicine, etc., that is also undefined. And running ahead of ourselves, what you will find in those studies is that experience is reduced most often to something which is studyable religious experience. That is, for example, attentional strategies, or some form of cognition, some form of cognitive processing, some form of physicalistic response that we can measure. So, and you'll see it in the papers that we will be reviewing today. There is, there are two problems here, further problems. First, we already outlined it, that religious part in experience is undefined. Now, the second problem is that experience itself is something which pertains to subjectivity. For us as theologians, human subjectivity is something very important and interesting and crucial, and we focus on it. We study the self, we write about the self, we study human subject, we're trying to understand the role of subjectivity in the overall cosmic, order, etc., in relationship to God, etc. But for objectivistic science, subjectivity is persona non grata because we feel it, but its mode of existence is not clear. And it's not like an object, like something we can touch or grasp by our senses, or decompose into parts which are researchable and then put together. So we cannot do that. Subjectivity is subjective, and that means that it may be not exactly illusory, but still not exactly as real and researchable as the world is, which is given objectively. Most of theories in cognitive science, they don't study subjectivity, but they study the mind. And the mind means a bunch of information processing processes or boxes or places in the brain, in the human body that we can study. So that's, of course, is a reduction, but it is a reduction which works very well in experimental conditions, because experiments are theory-laden. So as long as I can have a theory, I can have an experiment. But where do I get the theory? The theory I will get out of my assumptions about what is real, what is unreal, and out of another theory that I have about the experience. So the outcome of those experiments is theory-laden, and therefore confirms the theory. So there is this thing in cognitive science, well, at least it was very, very profound when I was working as an experimental scientist, which was, I finished my lab work in 2010. But up to that point, there was this multivariability in cognitive scientific research, which means that you can explain any given thing within a number of different theories, and all of them will work, and then you can construct experiments that will show that they work within the particular theory. So this is an advantage because we have many explanations and we can kind of broaden our knowledge. But for somebody who aspires to have a critically correct knowledge, that's a little bit frustrating situation. So it shows us complexity, but on the other side, it shows us the limitations of our knowledge. And so when it gets to religious experience, both parts of this term are problematic for research. First, the religious part, and then the second part is the part of experience itself, because it is related to subjectivity. So how do we translate it into the objective modes of research? So that's a big picture. Okay, so any questions or any concerns about this? Okay. Yeah, please.
So I was late when I touched on this, but has there been a unified definition in the field for religion?
For religion?
Yes, so that those who are studying can come to a conclusion on what religious means in the mode of experience, right? Mm-hmm. So has there been a unified definition of what that is in the field?
Yeah. Not that I know. Do you know? No, not that I know. Yeah.
So when I say religious experience and my friends say religious experience, the idea of religious in that phrase could be something different to all of us?
I don't know if that will be to that degree, because if you say, like let's say in this group, you already share, or I assume you do, a set of conventions. They may be unexamined, but interest in theology, affiliation with Graduate Theological Union, etc., etc. So people who share conventions and share space physically, like we do now, usually agree kind of intuitively on a set of points, and I'm not saying anything new, but there is a assumed agreement that we know what it is, but not until we start examining it. And when we start examining it, it's actually, as Husserl said, upon examination, all kinds of riddles show up. And we come to conclusion that we really don't know what that is, even though as a group we kind of act on assumptions that we know what that is. So.
And that's what's causing the problem in terms of trying to get at what religion is so it can be examined and studied?
Well, religion is what religious. It will have another problem. It will have another problem built into it. Not only the problem of definition with regard to religious, but another problem which is built into religious experience itself. And let me just pause and make a small detour, and then I will continue talking about it. I was about to ask you whether we should focus on concrete research first and then look into broader conceptual issues. But it seems that we are already taking the route from broader conceptual issues to research. So we will just take this route, and that's okay, right, with everybody? Okay. So the specific problem with religious experience is not as much in the definition of religion, but in the possibility and conditions of possibility for religious experience to happen. Because the dominant idea in the studies of experience, and now I'm looking into non-scientific studies, but philosophical and theological studies, the dominant idea in those studies is that experience is a relationship between the knower and the known. I know something. And even when I'm experiencing just knowing, just a sense of certainty, it's also in relationship to something, to objects of knowledge. Okay, so God, question is, all right, if religious experience is a form of experience, and experiencing means experiencing objects, then God should be an object of some kind. Well, it can be a world object, you know, can be as big as the universe, but still subject-object relationship of some kind. And then not only where does it put God, but where does it put me in this kind of relationship. So because if I'm in relationship with the object of my knowledge, that puts me outside of this object of knowledge, or if I am included into this object of knowledge, then on what terms and how, and what are the conditions of possibility for me to know this kind of object. So there were arguments in philosophy, and one of them is very important. I'm trying to Nick, The last name escapes me now, but I can look it up in my materials. And that's the paper that I should send you, probably, since you seem to be going in that direction in your thinking. The paper in analytic philosophy, which step by step, Nick Zangwill, the argument against a possibility of religious experience. And then there are theologians such as Platinga or Alston who argue in favor of religious experience. And then there is a whole bunch of philosophers in French phenomenology who also argue in favor of that experience, but they go deeper and they say that our conception of experience as subject-object relationship is limited, that there are forms of experience which are not necessarily organized like what we have now in our daily interaction, and that's where we should be looking for religious experience. Non-intentional, non-relational as subject and object forms of experience, forms of consciousness, will give us a platform for the study of religious experience. So that's where it goes. And at this point, I probably should turn to the board and write a couple of things. Okay, so argument against religious experience. Nick Zangwill. So please remind me if I forget. I'll try not to forget, but remind me to send the paper. So basically, God is not an object. Okay, and then so we should reconceptualize experience. So this point of view is in French theological phenomenology. Which will be the names such as Merleau-Ponty, Marion, Levinas, Henri, Chrétien, and others. This is pretty recent. It's approximately, I think that the argument can be dated to 1965. And then in theology, in actually analytic theology or systematic theology, this will be Platinga, Alston, okay, so this is a couple of names. So in those reconceptualizations of experience, they're actually extremely interesting because they offer a whole variety of perspectives on where God hides in givenness of consciousness. I want to mention another name. This is a Scandinavian philosopher, Espendal, And then yet another name, American philosopher Mike Barber. They offer very original and very interesting concepts of consciousness, which are applicable to the study of religious experience. For us to understand what that is, but not yet how to do it in scientific terms, in terms of natural science. Okay, so any questions on this part of the...
The first one is coming out of the Elianian school, is that?
Zangwill?
Yeah.
He's a philosopher.
Yeah.
You asked...
I thought I heard something about the Elianian.
No, okay. So all of this is philosophy. It's not religious studies. It's not the study of religion as such. This would be very intellectual, very abstracted examinations of consciousness. Nothing like you find in Iliad, which is applicable to religion itself. Okay. It's theory, hard and dry theory of human cognition, basically. Something that we hardly study in theological schools, while we should. See, the problem with this is that it becomes an interdisciplinary field, like all studies of consciousness. It doesn't exactly fit into the compartments that we created for it in higher education. You know, it wants to position itself, this knowledge, on the cracks, because it draws from different directions, and so it's really a paradox, you know, when you look around, like even looking at this beautiful, you know, picture here. It's all religious experience, rituals, murals, stained glass, environments that we create. It's all designed to inspire us to experience divine, and we, you know, we manage profoundly to push it out of the studies that we conduct formally, you know, or education. So this is a very interdisciplinary and a very controversial topic, actually, and. When it gets to the questions of funding of research, the term religious, you cannot, or it's hard to even receive funding, because it doesn't fit with the very pragmatic and very defined programs which are funded in research. So, in papers that I sent you, some of it are related to disciplines such as new ones, which are emerging. One of them is called neurotheology. Neurotheology. And for some people, neurotheology carries lots of promise. But it's an emerging discipline which struggles with all the contradictions and tensions that we mentioned up to now, and more. And so when one reads papers in neurotheology, it's often a feeling that the parts are running out of this artificially constructed unity, and they're just trying to run away while the author is trying to put them together somehow. So, but we should look at the papers themselves and see what's out there. Okay, so so you have two papers in this package that was sent, and one of them is an overview by Stockdale and so he right away in the introduction writes that research in this field can swing erratically between the extremes of rigorous science and the fringes of pseudoscience in a perplexing and sometimes downright odd way. So the reading, like let's say you are to prepare a lecture for your audience on some specific question of religious attitude, or like let's say you lecture perhaps in pastoral counseling system where you want to give the counselor some connection with the brain, with the physical body in terms of religious experience. And so you start drawing on this field of neurotheology in hope that you will find some solid data like you would do so with reviewing regular scientific literature. You go to PubMed and you Google or you enter neurotheology in your search and hope that you will get findings. No, you won't. You will get a bunch of disparate facts which are in themselves are in the process of constant revision and kind of now they find it and then the next day they cancel it, or there is a critique issued, and etc. So there is very, very little reliability in these findings. So there was a famous God helmet. If you heard of that. The God helmet is a device which is put on one's head, and then one is supposed to experience God. Or so even without God helmet, one can feel presence in the room. And so this presence is qualified as presence of God. How many people in this audience right now feel presence in the room? Exactly.
Hopefully we are feeling some presence, right?
Okay, all right. So how many here feel presence in between us, like sort of like the air has some kind of tangibility, and I can feel somebody looking at my back, for example, this kind of a feeling. Like, for example, if I were to stop talking and kind of be silent and ask you to close your eyes and, for example, and for a minute stop thinking that you are in the lecture space and there is a lecturer, can you feel my presence outside of your thinking, but just like sort of viscerally? Like energetically, you may say.
Yeah, so that's my question. I was wondering, what do they mean by feeling a presence?
Are they
Is that knowing that someone is out there,
they never
sensing something?
They never specified.
And this is a scientific experiment, right?
Correct. Exactly.
They don't even specify what.
No, they don't. They don't. So what they refer to is what in phenomenology we call it an atmospheric feeling, a feeling of some kind of tangibility in space. When this feeling is highlighted, mystics refer to it as oceanic feeling, the feeling like you are in the ocean of God, you know. It can be metaphoric, or it can be very concrete, related to this sort of energetic continuum, like in Qigong or Tai Chi, like people experience. Or Merleau-Ponty calls it flesh of the world, you know, or this atmospheric feeling, really, the feeling that there is something exceeding the boundaries of the human body that we can tap into. So, is that God? How is it related to God? It certainly tells us that there is something in our perception which is not just sensory within our defined modalities of senses, but given in a different way. There are conditions of possibility when this kind of perception kicks in, means that I have to stop my thinking for a moment, maybe close eyes and kind of shift my focus of attention. There will be philosophical conditions of possibility for that, because we need to think, how do we account for this givenness? If you have a mystical frame of reference in your mind, you may say, well, this is God. I used to, as a child, I used to think that this is God, and that's when they mean that God is so close, this is what they mean, that it's literally divine is present through this. There is a concept of social grace, which can be linked maybe somehow to this. There is a concept of shared group space, when we understand each other non-verbally, may be related to this, needs to be researched. But if one is in a mystical frame of reference, that can be referred to as divine presence. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so this divine presence doesn't require the presence of a personal type. It's not like it's the presence of a person. It's just more the presence of something that is external to me, that exists and that I can sense even if I'm not seeing, hearing, touching.
In this
kind of the normal sensory ways.
Mm-hmm.
I can still sense something, but it doesn't need to be personal.
Right, yeah. And that, of course, opens questioning, another big venue of questioning of the relationship, you know, yeah.
So because in the cases of people who have no religious cultural background whatsoever, and I know that you have studied this, and yet they report having religious experiences, like you know, in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. The kind of religious experiences that they report, are of this kind, the kind that is more like a general presence, or is it something more specific in terms of I really sense or I really experience a personal God?
Okay, there is a whole range of experiences in that situation. Most of them will be through of emotional nature, you know, longing. So that if I'm longing, there must be something. So the God is posited out of this longing. There may be visuals, imagination, visions, because you cannot eradicate the cultural trace, and it's, for example, in Tarkovsky movies, both those aspects are very expressed: longing and unusual visuals. And there certainly will be, in a group environment in the church, I think that in Orthodox churches especially, there is a lot of atmospheric feeling present. Now, there is introspection, or some kind of a shift of attention, which causes inwardness. And that creates a whole other phenomenal spectrum, which becomes experience of God for people. Now, when I say experience of God in introspection, it may be verbatim experience of the absolute. And that's what Alston, for example, who was influenced by phenomenology, argues for, that God is experienceable to us. And then Henri, in the list of French phenomenologists, will also be on that position, that God is experienceable, makes herself experienceable. Same in Marion. So it's not just religious experience, but there is an apodictic or veridical quality to this experience, that experience is really something which gives us God. And this becomes a theological question. So, and that's where theology has its argument.
I don't want to get off topic, but you said something that I related to one of the readings. I think it's Azari.
Yeah.
He mentions that religious experience is more cognitive than emotional, given the areas of the brain that are activated. It seems that in this kind of experiences that you were talking about, especially the ones that people in the Soviet Union with no religious cultural background, or not as strong religious cultural background, seems that it's at work with emotion, as you were saying, this
longing. Yes, yes. But then again, you see.
Do you agree with him, or would you disagree with Azari, or?
I agree. I agree. There are two papers by Azari, and one of them I like, the other one I like less. So let me. I think I remember correctly.
So, I mean, this is getting on you off topic. I feel like.
No, it's not. This. One of the advantages that I appropriated with regard to this event is that we can explore and have a dialogue. So let me get to Azari. I think it's here, yeah, okay. So this is the paper which is interesting, I think, because it gives us not only a possibility of neurocorrelation, but because it gives us a possibility of theology. And so I want to talk a little bit about it, and this will be, actually this is much more interesting than neurotheology section. No, really, because with neurotheology I thought that I need to make an obligatory nod to neurotheology because it's a catchy name, and it sort of presents itself as a science which connects theology and neuroscience. But in fact, there is not much really. But in those separate papers, you sometimes find very interesting perspectives. And so Azari is one of those of such papers. So okay. So one of the topics here in this paper is neurocorrelation. Neurocorrelation will be an approach which enables us to correlate subjective event of experience and some kind of pattern in brain activity which we think is specific to this form of experience, to this form of subjective experience. So we can do several things with this. We can keep researching the brain and refining our correlative findings. We can make a reverse loop and go from what we find in the brain and neurologically back to experience and clarify the form of experience this way. That's one part. Another part, which I think is more interesting for theologians, is that we can develop theologies out of the data delivered to us by neurocorrelation. So this is one question, neurocorrelation itself. But another question is how it transfers into theological research. And there is a journal of analytic philosophy, analytic theology. Started by a group of young theologians, and one of them, for example, Josh Cocaine, writes specifically, transfers the findings of experience and sometimes neurocorrelation into theology. You also find it in Trinitarian phenomenology of Marion. You also find it in Henri, specifically on emotions. Because for metaphysicians or theologians who connect experience of God with feeling, the feeling it's not only relational, it's self-affective. Means that when we experience feeling, it is different from cognition in a sense that I know this, it's always objectifying cognition. But when I experience emotion, emotion is not necessarily tied to an object. For example, when I experience longing, it's directed, but it is open-ended. Okay, and so because it is open-ended, it's sort of like longs for itself. It's self-affective, and that is one of the theories of religious experience that we call religious, feeling of this specific self-affectivity when it becomes available to us, not directed at something. Now we can interpretively attach relatedness to this feeling. Means that I can posit God, and then when I long, I say I long for God, but it's still not the same as my emotion would be directed at the chair or at the other person. Okay, so we posit unknown other for whom we long, but the religious sense comes from the substance of longing itself. So that would be one of theories. And her paper here, or Azari's paper, it gives a possibility of that kind of theological transfer. Now, the same can be done with regard to perception of something. That's Marion Trinitarian. The Trinitarian structure of perception must be given due to the presence of Trinity. So things like that. So you take cognition and you transfer it into theological contexts. Now, this is criticized also, this kind of approach, in it's criticized by theologians. Falk, another name, French theologian, writes, I hope I'm correct, F-A-L-C. So Falk writes about dialogue between theology and philosophy, which needs to happen because the objections to this line of thinking, when you take something in the human experience and build theology out of it, not simplistically, it can be a very sophisticated building, but nevertheless the line of thinking is such. Objections will be that, well, these are not trained theologians, that these are people, these are philosophers who don't know systematic theology. They don't know how theology emerges in groups and the whole structure of the argument. They never read somebody like Pannenberg, they hardly know that it exists. And so they come up with their revelations without being trained. But that's exactly when dialogue, I think, needs to happen, but it's slowly happening incrementally. But that's where you can take neurocorrelations, because I think that theological research, unless it refers to social issues, theological research is pretty much in stagnation. I mean, it wasn't delivering much new things over the last 50 years, new texts, maybe new interpretations, but not new data. And we are getting a lot of new data in this new enlightenment going on in science, with the Green Revolution, with the decade of the brain, etc. So that can transfer into theological research upon proper strict reflection. But it's slow, and so I think that this paper gives this possibility, actually. Let's the second paper. So, so the areas, now, another part of your question, okay, what if we take emotion not phenomenologically but scientifically as something related to the certain area of the brain? So that's the neurocorrelation itself. Okay, so in the papers that I sent you, and I need to send you, I think, another bunch, actually. There is another group of papers related to neurocorrelation that is projecting experience onto the brain. So that Vega, Tart, and then Wildman, and then let's see. Okay. So what do we need to look for in this area of neurocorrelations? If we find papers which have this structure, I found something in the brain, it seems to be specific, and here is this experience, so I can correlate the two. So there are several areas of consideration that we need to keep in mind when we are in this field, which would be localizationist localizationist paradigm. So if I were to draw the brain, let's say the brain, localizationist paradigm looks at concrete locations in the brain which lit up or become active in case of experiencing certain, like this area, parietal, or this area, amygdala, or this area, the visual cortex. Either electrophysiologically or in tests such as fMRI, you need to find a place in the brain which acts differently in case of experience. Localizationist. Another one will be nonlinear dynamics.
Non-linear dynamics?
Yeah, and another one, well, maybe we can, I'll explain it in a second, just write it down. Complexity-based approach, which will say that the brain acts as an ensemble, as a community, as a global space. So that, yeah, we have those areas lighting up, but we don't know what's going on somewhere else because we focused on a particular area. Remember this multi-variability? So yeah, well, okay, I applied my tests to a particular area of the brain, but there may be something else going on somewhere. I cannot say that it's causal. I can just say, well, they do have some correspondence. And nonlinear dynamics also has a sort of vague assumption that the main area of activity or change will be not the tissue of the brain, but the electromagnetic field which happens due to the brain, is generated by the brain or exists around the brain. So we had a very good, interesting scientist, an Augustinian actually philosopher at UC Berkeley, Walter Friedman, who died a couple of years ago. So he was one of the leading figures in this field of nonlinear dynamics. Why nonlinear dynamics? Because this field doesn't act in linear ways. It behaves as a complexity system. It has phase shifts, the attractors, whatnot. So this is a nonlinear dynamics. And there is a good chance that we find correlations, or we can find correlations between systemic involvement of the brain or even the change in the electromagnetic fields and subjective experience, specifically religious experience. Another model that will operate here is cognitivistic, which will be that correlations are not with the regions of the brain and not with the dynamics of the electromagnetic field, but with information processing. With information processing in the brain.
That also requires the whole brain, right? I mean, that will focus on the whole brain holistically, or? Or specific pathways between those imaginable boxes. Because what this theory does, it says, okay, well, like let's say we know that one of the centers of attention are here in the parietal zone, but we cannot isolate a piece of brain which would be this center of attention. We sort of think about it as hardware and software. Well, that's the operating metaphor. So in the computer, there will be probably a group of chips or some mechanical stuff correlating to a certain information processing, but not exactly. So it's like a layer in itself. In the model of non-reductive physicalism, there is an assumption of several ontological kind of layers which can be correlating. So here we are having a sort of the same situation. There are ontological levels of the functioning of the nervous system and brain, and so the correlation can be with regard to any of those layers. That's the complexity of it. Okay, another zone of neurocorrelation, and that can be probably written down as specific studies, is the correlation with the self, new self theories of cognition. It's another area that we can talk about.
Okay, and maybe since we're talking resources, I should point to the society website now.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think I can access internet here?
I think so, yeah, you should.
Let's see. Okay, so this is the society that was founded in 2016 with the first conference in phenomenology of religious experience at Patriarch Athenagoras Orthodox Institute, and then we had another conference at the Jesuit School of Theology, and yet another conference in Prague at Prague Institute of Philosophy. So it's now kind of cascading because there are so many questions simply that people want to look into and answer.
The one in Prague just happened. We just came back from there, right? The conference in Prague, we just came back.
I just came back from that, yeah, and it was amazing, actually. Amazing. The amazing part was that it caused interest from a leading scientific institution, this Prague Institute of Philosophy. So here in the United States, I must say it's a struggle to get this kind of thematics into the curriculum or on the research radar. And in Europe, because they are more, continental philosophy and phenomenology is theirs, right?
However, I feel that in Europe are more close to the, I'm from Spain, they're more close to the religious aspect of things, whereas in America they are more open. And do you feel that too or not?
I feel that too as a scientist, be a Russian scientist initially, but now with this religious revival, in a sense, in countries of Central Europe, they are interested. Poland, Czechia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, this was Czech Republic, and it was amazing to be with these thematics in the old, academic building sponsored by this academic institution, which is very, very established and reputable, and they think it's a cutting edge. So, which I agree with. I mean, it is a cutting edge, but anyway, we are not funded in the United States anywhere, despite being a cutting edge. So this is what it is, and this organization is loosely associated with GTU. It's an academic society, and which is, 1.5 year old. But we conduct conferences, and this was this last conference, image, phenomenon, and imagination in religious experience. So we had about 60 pages for 3 days. We had 3 very solid keynotes, and the next conference will be on description of religious experience, because how do you really describe it? The problem with description is this. Let us just talk a little bit about it.
Where's the next conference?
Next conference will be in Valparaiso University in Indiana, yeah. And
Okay, Indiana. I thought you were asking.
well, Valparaiso. Or Valparaiso, how do you pronounce it? Okay, it's sponsored by Valparaiso. Indiana.
Muncie, yeah, all states in Muncie. Valparaiso is southern Indiana.
Yeah. So we'll have more information. I didn't yet update the website. By the way, if anybody has passion for volunteering, there are plenty of volunteering possibilities. So that this will be organized by our members, and it's a rotating conference. So in 2020 we hope to have it in Vienna, and then 2021 probably will come back to GTU. Maybe Dominican would like to host it. Yeah, but we should get together, 3 of us really. But here also the resources on this website are this. We have publications and active calls for papers, and then open theology. It's a very good open access platform. European publisher as well publishes annual issues with us, and there is a volume on religious experience which is coming out with Springer. It should be out early in 2019. So if you, yes, and of course there is membership, which is available to students at no fee, and the core membership, professional, I think it's $35, and then affiliate membership $25 per year. So we keep it very affordable. And what we do have here is also the webinars, which are free, and they serve in place of education in the eclectic sphere of various skills that this kind of research requires. So we basically study foundational phenomenological texts, and because it's not a curriculum and it's not some kind of organized educational institution, it tends to be people come at different levels, they ask questions, and we just have reading groups and discussions. And this is very horizontal. One of the things that we are trying to do, and when I say we, it's really a community. So there are 2 mailing lists, one for the webinar and the other one for the general society. And the general is informational, and webinar there are all kinds of discussions happening. And so it's a really grassroots, bottom-up created organization, and I just try to keep the strings together of it. Okay, so that back.
The link on an email? Oh, I guess I have it.
You have it. It's in my yeah.
Yes.
So and just email me, with anything. When because the next webinar will be on. December 28th, and then it's once per month, usually the reading group, 2 hours on Friday morning, 10 to 12, and we don't record them in order to ensure the authenticity of discussion, so that people, don't shy of asking questions, etc. And now it is on a difficult text, which is Husserl's Crisis of European Sciences. Why we read this text? Because he has a connection established between ethico-religious sphere of experience and historicity in this text. So he looks exactly into the questions which are generally treated in systematic theology, but as a phenomenologist. And this is his last work, which is eclectic. He never finished this as a book. So it's basically disparate sections, so we have to stitch it together as readers in our mind. This requires preparedness, but what we usually do with new people coming, we recommend a couple of beginning texts, and then people study on their own. And initially it's very frustrating because there are many, you are facing basically a whole unknown terminology, but it gradually sinks in, and usually by the second year of frustration, one is comfortable. And then one learns that any questions are welcome, and that is the atmosphere. So I wanted to talk a little bit back to neurocorrelation, talk about the multi-realizability of religious experience in a phenomenological sense. Because what Marga, what you pointed out, that she talks about emotion as a which longing, right, etc. So that would be several levels in the nervous system. By the way, do you have any more questions on that? Or any questions, or what was the question?
So the question was like, it seemed that she was downplaying the role of emotion in religious experience, which I found interesting because that way you can accommodate a lot of people who are religious but they never experience floating or something which is, shocking or special. So that seems to accommodate better the fact that religiosity has to do with thoughts and beliefs. However, that's not how we normally think of having a religious experience. Think of it as something that is very emotional. So I thought it was interesting, but also perplexing.
Okay.
When she said that it seemed that in religious experience there was a clear activation of areas of the brain that have to do with cognition, so that was more like a cognitive experience, more than something related to the activation of the limbic system, like more related to emotion. So I was curious about what your opinion was about that. I don't know if the problem is that since we are calling religious experience to so many things,
okay,
right, everything could be accommodated as being a religious experience, whether it's cognitive or emotional.
Right. So yes, I understand. Yeah. So I wanted to compare, but maybe we can even speed it up because you just gave us a foundation on this. So the same multi-realizability which exists in the brain with regard to various cognitive phenomena, it's even more of this in experience itself. So we can already, based on the data accumulated even within the work of the society, pulling it all together, we can map experience in terms of the locations associated with religious experience. And so I probably don't even need to draw, but just can talk about it. So one of the spheres will be emotional, as you say, then another ethics that's living us, right? And so that's a very interesting area of research of experience with regard to religious experiencing, because like when we say good and bad, again, what is it that we mean? So it can be judgment, it can be feeling, it can be approached communally, it can be approached behaviorally. So you know this more than I do because I'm not an ethician, or how do you say it? I don't study ethics specifically, but the concept of what is good or what is bad, they are at the core, of course, of religious discourse, and they also change historically. So when we associate religious experience with emotion, we can do it from the standpoint of ethics. We can do it from the standpoint of judgment. And we can do it also from the standpoint of emotional self-affectivity. And we can do it also from the standpoint of emotion or its aspect of self-affectivity being the core of the self. So it branches out into whole spectrum of possible locations of research. And where do we go on that spectrum? Depends on description. So, because when I'm describing religious experience, I want to describe it in such a way that I capture the religious quality of it, what it is for me as religious experience. And then if the locations of this religious determinant of experience are so many possible placements, then where do I go in my description? Okay, another problem here is that there is pre-reflective experience, an experience which I reflect upon and thematically digest. Okay, so do I change religious quality of experience in transition from pre-reflective to reflective? Okay, does it get lost somehow? Another question is religious experience a matter of interpretation, or is it a matter of direct intuition? And if I'm intuiting, what am I intuiting? What area, what placement? Now, again, in phenomenology, one of the big concepts in terms of the study of experience is absence and presence. Like, for example, if I'm looking at my hand, do I look at the hand or do I look at the gaps between the fingers? And what role the gaps between the fingers play in my perception of the hand. So that's presence, my hand, and the absence in between, the background absence, became already a common sense understanding. So there are very interesting thinkers who suggest that religious experiencing is basically associated with absences, because absences mask the mystery. So that sense of awe that initially inaugurates philosophy in ancient Greece, so that sense of awe is also inaugurating religious experiences. You said we sense noetic, well, you didn't say exactly that, but in that direction. We sense the noetic quality of experience, and that's awesome when we sense that. So how is it that the instances of the unknown are constituted by consciousness for us in such a way that we can turn it into religious experience? And then another thing here, that those instances of unknown, they can be related to others, or they can be related to me. Do I know myself? Do I know others beyond their appearance to me? And so how does my consciousness cope with it? So these are the questions that we look at in the study, in the phenomenology of religious experience. And it grows, it spreads in terms of this multiple locations of experience. And there is probably a way to link it to texts and to link it to textual descriptions, to the analysis of the descriptions, which is basically, that's what is studied in most theological dissertations, I think. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
So what you were saying, you told me in an email, how, so basically like these two disjointed paths, one, the neuroscience, the other one of the religious experience. You were mentioning how these two directions that seem to be following different paths could be made more. We kind of find the true correlations in description, right?
I think so, yeah.
And the phenomenology, you were saying, it's going to be able to fill that gap. Now, but that phenomenology, you mean like fine-tuned descriptions of the religious experience will give us like a platform to sort of map from the neurological point of view what's going on in the brain?
I think so. I think so. Yeah, I can bring, shall I, just a question, I can give you an example of this.
Okay, yes, please.
Okay, I will have to talk for about 5 minutes with this. Okay. We did an experiment in 2009 with studying the visual processing in Tibetan monks. And I'll just give an example how phenomenology can be possibly translated into an experiment on this. So the reason to study those monks was that Dalai Lama made a claim that Tibetan monks can hold visual images, very bright, very multi-aspected images for hours without degradation. It's like I visualize this, this deity, and then either I look at it, at his or her mandala with the celestial cities, or I can become this deity in deity yoga. I can impersonate this deity, but still I hold the visualization, and it stays for hours just the same, and I can do things with this, but it stays most of the time the same. This is not true for human normal visual cognition, because our internal imagery changes all the time, and it has to, because if the image were stuck, we wouldn't be able to operate, because we would have been like this snapshot, I turn my head, but I would be still remembering this snapshot. So that contradicted the theory, and the lead researcher, because I was a phenomenologist on the project, but the lead researcher wanted to figure out either Dalai Lama is lying or no, he's not lying, but His Holiness is not lying, but maybe monks exaggerate their claims, or maybe it's a legend, a myth of some kind, and in reality it's not happening that way. Or if this is happening that way, then how do we account for this? So there was research which showed that monks do keep those images, and that so that's the example of the image. It's a very poor picture, but you've seen those tankas many times, so that's what they keep in mind. And then, give me please one of the results. So this is the tests by which visual memory is tested, and I want to get to the end table. So what this table shows basically that the efficiency of memory of mental rotation, that's a certain test, increases upon the practice of deity yoga meditation, and then in the practice of open presence, when there is no imagery entrainment, it doesn't increase, and so in all the controls, there was also no such an effect. So it was concluded that indeed there is an increase of short-term visual memory, so that this is a true claim, that the brain does something to account for this effect, and then we don't know what that is, so that the assumption was made that brain reallocates energy resources in such a way that this box the information processing box in our information processing system suddenly gets more energy, and that's why this memory is possible. Okay, that is of course a metaphor, this information box. And of course the conclusion is theory laden, because the only thing we know about this construct, information processing, and about this construct, visual memory box, so to say. The only concept we have that it's getting energized by something. So it's a metaphor basically from a computer. You know, you plug it in, it's energized, and then you push the keys, and the energy is directed somewhere, and then you're getting the output on the display. So whether this is what is happening in the brain for real or not, we don't know. It's a metaphorical explanation within the semi-metaphorical theory, which is getting experimental proofs. So there is some correlation, but it's not descriptive in the sense that it gives us no idea whatsoever what is really going on, you know, just approximation. So, so that's the phenomenological part of it in a separate paper. That's what we can do in order to translate religious experience into scientific experiment. Well, first of all, we have to create maps of consciousness, structural maps that correspond to the condition of a religious experience. So there are those maps here which resonate with different modes of meditation. Also metaphorical, but at least it's a little bit more of a overall reflection on the structure of meditation. And here in table 2, so what I'm suggesting is, or was suggesting then, that we take different modalities of consciousness available in our ordinary common sense natural attitude, and then we can map them onto different instances of religious experiencing, in this case, different meditation styles. And then we can zoom into that particular modality which is mostly involved with this or that particular type of religious experiencing. And this is a very general approach to this, just kind of the idea. But this is the work that we need to do in phenomenology. Take religious experience, really map it cognitively, but phenomenologically, cognitively, and then start translating it into the science. And see, here with Tibetan meditation or any kind of meditation, it's an easy job because it's mostly not about religious experiencing, but about, you know, how I tweak my mind in order to be silent or to be illumined, etc. So it's sort of more physicalistic, but when it gets, I mean, religious experience is unruly. It's a givenness. It's not something that I make. I can make myself attractive for God to come. You know, I can meditate and invite guests, but I cannot act on behalf of guests to cause religious experience. So there is a predisposition, but there is no causality involved. And so, but we can study predisposition at least, and then we can study instances of religious experience through this kind of mapping. Now, what's interesting in this study in particular, that let's say, scientifically we were able to say that when the deity is impersonated, it's really, this shifts of memory happen, as against to when there is no visual imagery or when there is a non-religious imagery. There is one more control which was not included into this interpretation, which is a comparison of impersonation of the deity, which is deity yoga, with mandalic representation of deity's universe. So and that has and that actually showed an interesting effect which we didn't know how to interpret then, so that part was left out simply. So, but what happens is that when I become a deity, then memory increases. When I look at the deity, memory doesn't increase. Okay? So that's a big question mark as to why. Another thing is that these are the data in the first 20 minutes of meditation, but it lasts for hours. And what happens as it lasts, then the practitioner enters clear light and all the visuals are dissolved, and there is just a luminous quality of self-awareness in experience. So is that what's going on in the background of visualization? And maybe that is responsible for the effect, and not the suggestion. And what that is, how to translate it into the whole brain functioning, it's not clear as well. So there are, when something scientific is published, I think that there are questions which are left outside of the report for the sake of publishability of something. And those questions, they are in phenomenological descriptions. They can be raised in phenomenological description. Because if it's a good description, it doesn't circumscribe the phenomenon, but it gives the total picture. And so, so that's actually a response to she downplays the role of emotion. Because in her very structured experimentation, that's what is plausible. But you're absolutely right that the essential component of religious experience is emotive, even though it may not be a regular emotion. You know, it can be a modified emotion. For example, one thing which happens in religious emotion is transformed. It's transmuted from kind of forms such as anger or fear into more exaltation or bliss or mirth or joy, or there is a teleology and continuity which is difficult to account for even in description. So that's why I say it may not be a regular emotion. It may be some kind of a specific thing which is going on.
So this is a great example, right, of different types of meditation and what is involved, different parameters.
Yeah.
Has anyone done anything like that relating, I would call it 3 types of religious experiences. I mean, there may be thousands, but just to simplify things, the ones that are described by, I forgot his name, sorry, one of the papers that someone describes them as normal religious experiences, the ones that are pathological, caused by
that's another,
and so on, and then the ones that are caused by psychedelics. So has anyone sort of
No, there are
see what's going on there?
No, it hasn't been done, and that is exactly, there is another area like pathology. What is pathology, or what is a diagnostic mistake, or then and then psychedelics, of course, which mimic experience, but I don't know even whether they qualify to be called entheogens, because maybe it's all interpretive. There is no comparison. There is one paper by Arthur Hastings who says that basically psychedelics and meditation do the same thing phenomenologically, but there is no mapping whatsoever. I think that they are just beginning really, or there were attempts of more or less systematic mappings with regard to mushrooms, but there is nothing really systematic, across the board.
So in the case of psychedelics, since you mentioned this, do you think that perhaps it's not, so you're saying it mimics a religious experience? However, there are people who become religious because of those experiences. Do you think it's a process that is, after the fact, basically, because I have experienced something that was detached from the pure materiality that we believe that's all we have around us. Then that makes me think there is something else, as opposed to the experience itself. It counts as a religious experience.
Yeah.
I mean, would you say that, or?
Well, you know, I think that they say that a lot of it depends on set and setting. So from the very beginning, they set up the interpretive atmosphere for the experience. You know, and it's that much is clear. What's happening in the experience itself, in terms of what is the chemistry that is involved with particular religious aspect of experience, I don't know. I don't think that anybody can answer. Really, because like taking ketamine, for example, ketamine, the biological effect of ketamine is pretty well known. It dissociates the cortical processes from the subcortex. So normally those two stratas of the brain, they are very intertwined and closely communicate. So ketamine just chops the connection. And it's a horrible experience of depersonalization. But for some people, somehow that equates with the loss of self, typical for religious experiencing. And then this experience becomes a field for religious experiencing. And it's whatsoever, it's not clear. Why and how is it that for somebody the same experience is positive and for somebody it is negative? You know, they teach in guided sessions how to turn a negative experience into positive by relaxation and acceptance and whatnot. But why bother even, you know? It's not that you're accepting God, it's just a chemical influence. So, but yeah, it's a big question, you know? But I think that phenomenology actually carries answers to these questions. Yeah.
I'm very interested in using psychedelics as research, and as somebody who has participated in the phenomenology of such. You're talking about ketamine and how it disassociates. Well, so many psychedelics have different experiences, and so that's something that's really interesting in terms of religious experience. For example, in the Amazon, you take ayahuasca, and then overwhelmingly, even Western people and local tribal people, they experience this Gaia, this feminine spirit of the Amazon, and they actually interact with it, talk to it, speak with it, and it knows them and speaks about their lives and all this stuff. So, and then you have DMT, which is this really radical psychedelic where you essentially, feels like you go into outer space and you're in, a totally different dimension. But entities, again, that know you, know who you are, know about your life, and it seems like you know them because it seems very familiar, though it's so strange. So, I just wanted to add that in terms of these psychedelics. And then meditation. I can't imagine somebody claiming that meditation and psychedelics are doing the same thing. Only somebody who hadn't taken psychedelics can say that. Because it's totally not the same thing. It allows pathways to open up where certain experiences can be performed, but the intensity of the experiences are on another level.
I would disagree with you for the reason that meditation, which is taught in most of our contexts, it's a mild, surface-level, secularized form of self-regulation made safe for Westerners. But let's say I do tantric meditation, which means I go in the middle of the night on a graveyard. I sit there surrounded by corpses. I meditate on the perishability of my life. I give away for hours each attachment that I can find in myself into this graveyard demons so that they strip my essence of those attachments. I go deeply into the multidimensionality of my internal universe, and I find the locations in which I experience profoundly altered, expanded, numinous, cognitively stable states.
Okay.
That is not taught.
Well, I would say that I don't disagree that that can happen, but then if you do that same experiment, you know, go to the graveyard and then take 5 hits of LSD, that's a totally different experience, and it's way more intense. You know, like the same experience could happen, but
it depends on what kind of meditation is done, for how long, and I'm absolutely convinced that Tibetan Tantra, for example, can produce experiences which exceed any capacity of psychedelic initiation. I'm talking about it not as a theoreticist, but as a teacher and practitioner for many years. And the reason why people stop taking psychedelics is because they become a limiting agent in the freedom of internal perception, which can be guaranteed by those exercises. If you, for example, take somebody like Teresa of Avila, bridging it to Christian tradition, okay, do you think that, or would you say that psychedelics would enhance or inhibit her experience of interior castles? I think they would inhibit it, because psychedelic gives, or another group which has very profound forms of internal experiences is Radha Swami Satsang, spiritual science. There is an Indian guru which teaches gradual Kundalini trance, etc. You know, or Kundalini Patanjali Yoga Care, there is this organization. There are forms of meditation which deconstruct the mind and pull out the possibilities of consciousness in such a way that we cannot even fathom or imagine them in the ordinary state of consciousness. And in religious experiencing, attention goes spontaneously into those realms, you know. So we can, by means of psychedelics, open those realms for people who are not, you know, who won't be sitting for months and then, you know, meditating in a particular way. For people who have some other things to do, we probably can do it psychedelically, but I'm a wrong person to advocate for this, because I have this other form of experience which
So, Olga,
is accessible.
You say that, well, they may get you to a similar place, but one is getting you there just by tapping into something organic in the brain, where the other ones, I mean, obviously it's tapping into the same source, just requires the training. And as such, the training can take you to different levels.
It's aesthetic, yeah.
The psychedelic can take you here, that through training, you know.
I think it goes absolutely
farther,
beyond, yeah.
Farther. So this is like a shortcut, and it will have a cup. As long as, you know, the cup will be how much the chemistry can do in consciousness, given the the differences in psychedelic drug.
Yeah.
And maybe through training, you can, you know, tap in there, but it also go farther. I mean, this is what I'm hearing.
right. I just
On something very physical.
That's the difficulty of this whole presentation is with phenomenology in general, is that you can't get away from being subjective. So somebody meditating and taking a course in these deep, you know, Tibetan style meditations, well, some person could do that for a year, not just 30 days, do it for a year and still not get to that place. And some person could, you know, use psychedelics and develop, you know, ritualistic mechanisms to get there. So that's the difficulty in all this stuff, is to say, you know, to make statements about certain paths being better or less, or in other paths. I mean, that's, again, how can anybody make that claim?
Okay. I think it's possible to find a phenomenological distinction between the two forms of experience if you take it also temporarily and in terms of the temporal constitution. That's number one. Number two, which is also related to temporality but in biological ways, is that there are no studies, or there were no studies of condition of health of people who take psychedelics and what psychedelics on a long, continuous basis for a long time. I met a man who had 300 LSD sessions, and he loved every minute of it. Now, I at that time I was very poor in the beginning of my career, and I earned my living by doing breath work. And so conducting intense breathwork sessions. So I conducted intense breathwork session with him, and he got on all four in this altered state and became a tiger and was roaring and rocking in that altered states of consciousness in breathwork. So if you have somebody with consciousness which is close to evolutionary state of a animal consciousness, for him, those 300 LSD sessions worked very well because they cracked his fixation and propelled him into the higher realms of consciousness, which otherwise he couldn't access, being who he is. But I think that we are facing here a more understanding of the structure of human being and who we are, and then what different methods work for us. The caution, though, is that there is at least 2 cases of deterioration of the brain as the result of extensive use of psychedelics for spiritual purposes, with Terence McKenna and Alice Agar, another good friend in that movement. Both developed, Terence, I think, had brain cancer, and she had some kind of neurological degradation, which wasn't diagnosed, like early Alzheimer's or something like this. So we don't know what they do on a long-term basis, right, and how they operate by this skyrocketing effect.
Yeah. According to the doctors that treated his brain cancer, it had nothing to do with his use of psychedelics.
How do they know?
Well, just based that you have 2 examples and how many people have taken these and how many people on Amazon have taken these for thousands of years. And how often psychedelics mimic actual brain chemistry? I mean, it's usually just a few molecules that you change, and now you have serotonin. Especially the tryptamines.
No. First of all, on Amazon, they're taking a natural ingredient, which may be toxic, but it's natural nevertheless. How this compares with artificial substances such as LSD or 2CB or other, kinds of stuff, that we don't know. Now, the garmalin-based altered states of consciousness, they were not only known through, they are not only known through Amazon evidence, they were also present in the Iranian history, in the cult of Haoma, and it's a fact that mind-altering rituals exist in different religions. Right. It's also a fact that religious discourses such as yoga or right-handed tantra object against the use of psychedelics. So, for the reason of this fixated consciousness or impurity or bliss which comes by wrong means. And those arguments or disputes like the one we're having now, they are not new.
Right.
because even 3,000 years ago, in the foundational corpus of Zoroastrianism, the poetry composed by ancient Iranian poet priest Zarathustra, there is also already a scathing critique of Haoma cult. Back then, when they were all shamanic. But for Zarathustra, God enjoys complicated forms of speech. And that's the thing which gets knocked down in Haoma cult. So there is bliss, but there is bliss for the wrong reasons. And Zarathustra personally didn't like the physical effects of it, like vomiting and whatnot. So it depends on predisposition. I'm not doubting, I completely agree with you on what you say, but we all make choices, right. And those choices are different. There is a researcher in Czechia, in Czech Republic, a philosopher who is trying to develop philosophical reflection on the use of psychedelics, and he likes them very much. He's a postdoc researcher. I would be happy to put you in touch with him if you want to connect with it. But I think that what is needed is really serious philosophical and theological reflection, because otherwise we are just trading opinions, and I won't give my opinion for anything, likewise you won't. But we don't have enough reflection to really position it. I think that would be my idea. Okay, we need to wrap it up. Yeah.
Thank you. You want to say something else? Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No. I wanted to say that there is one section in the papers on Wittgenstein, and Wittgensteinians are very interesting. They say that it's in a certain form of speech that particular experience is happening, that it's speech itself is where God dwells in experience, and that's yet another location.
Also good. I'm happy because that's what he likes.
Okay, all right, yeah. So it's a big field.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have a lot more